Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really digging into the whole world of digital asset regulation in the U.S.
Yeah.
It's constantly changing.
It really is. A whirlwind is a good word for it.
Yeah. And we've got some great sources to help us navigate it. Thomson Reuters Institute, Fenwick, Money Laundering Watch, Lexology, DeFi Planet, a real mix.
Good cross-section.
Our mission basically is to cut through some of that fog, figure out where crypto regulation actually stands right now.
What are the SEC and CFTC really up to?
Exactly. What's Congress trying to do? And how does the new Trump administration's approach fit into all this?
It feels like everyone's trying to find that balance, right? Clear rules, but without, killing the innovation.
It's a definite tightrope walk.
For sure. And the ground has shifted quite a bit. I mean, initially it really looked like the SEC was going to be the main player, the primary regulator for crypto.
Yeah, that seemed to be the direction.
But as Thomson Reuters points out, they've hit some bumps in the road, some significant pushback in court.
Right, those cases like Ripple.
Exactly. The Ripple decision where XRP sales on exchanges weren't seen as securities offerings, and then the grayscale ETF thing.
Oh, yeah, where the court basically said the SEC's rejection was arbitrary and capricious.
Right. Those rulings definitely put a check on their momentum, you could say.
It felt like they were trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, maybe. Trying to use old securities rules for these new digital things.
That's a common criticism, yeah. So while the SEC was dealing with these legal fights,
The CFTC was doing something different.
well, the Thomson Reuters piece calls it a more measured approach. And it seems like they've been sort of steadily carving out their space, especially in DeFi.
Decentralized finance. Okay.
Mhm.
So is that necessarily better? I mean, is a more specific approach from the CFTC helpful, or could it mean maybe less oversight in some ways than the SEC wanted?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? What's interesting is the CFTC seems willing to tackle the really unique legal stuff that comes up with DeFi.
Like the Uki DAO case.
Exactly. That was huge. The court saying a DAO, this online group run by code, could be treated as a legal person under the Commodity Exchange Act.
Wow. So it could be held liable.
Yeah. First time establishing federal jurisdiction over a DAO like that. It's a pretty big precedent.
Definitely changes the game for DAOs. They're not just operating in some kind of legal gray area anymore.
Not quite, no. But even within the CFTC, this move into DeFi hasn't been totally smooth sailing.
Right. Thomson Reuters mentioned some dissent.
Yeah, Commissioner Mersinger had concerns about some of those enforcement actions against DeFi platforms like 0x, Open, DaredX for registration failures.
What was her issue?
She basically questioned using enforcement when there wasn't clear fraud or manipulation alleged, and she also raised doubts about whether the CFTC even had jurisdiction in those specific cases.
So even internally, there's debate about how far the CFTC's reach should go in DeFi. It really shows how tricky it is applying old rules to new tech.
Absolutely.
Okay, so SEC facing challenges, CFTC stepping into the DeFi space, but with some internal questions. It feels like enforcement actions alone aren't going to fix the uncertainty, right?
Probably not. You need a clearer framework.
Which brings us to Congress, because there have been quite a few attempts, proposed bills, trying to set up more formal rules. And a lot of them seem to point towards the CFTC taking a bigger role.
Yeah, there's a definite pattern there if you look at the bills. The Digital Commodity Exchange Act, Responsible Financial Innovation Act, DCCTA, FITC Act, they all sort of lean towards giving the CFTC the main authority over the spot markets, where crypto is actually bought and sold.
For digital commodities, specifically.
Right, and CFTC Chair Benham has been pretty vocal about supporting something like the DCCPA.
Especially after FTX collapsed, right?
Exactly. He uses that LedgerX example, the FTX company that was CFTC registered, and points out how it didn't go down with the rest because of their rules. It's a pretty powerful argument for their kind of oversight.
Yeah, that's a concrete example. Okay, now, more recently, Fenwick and Lexology talk about this new discussion draft from House Republicans, a big, comprehensive market structure bill.
Right. This one tries to set up a more detailed system.
But it's not just handing everything to the CFTC, is it?
No, it's aiming for more of a dual regulatory setup.
Okay.
The idea is the CFTC gets primary oversight of the intermediaries, the exchanges, brokers, dealers.
Okay.
But the SEC would still be involved, especially with assets that look more like traditional securities or with new tokens before their blockchain becomes mature.
Right, this mature blockchain idea.
Okay.
So even with this plan, could there still be confusion? Like, where does one agency's job end and the others begin?
That's always the risk with dual regulation, yeah.
Yeah.
potential overlaps or gaps.
Mm.
But they are trying to define it.
So they define digital commodity based on its link to the blockchain value, voting rights, use for fees, things like that.
Exactly. And Fenwick notes securities, some stablecoins, derivatives are specifically excluded from that definition.
Okay, so that helps draw the line for the CFTC's turf.
Right. And then the SEC keeps its jurisdiction using the old tests, Howey and Reeves, to see if something's an investment contract, a security.
The classics.
Yeah. But what's really new here and quite significant is this proposed 4-year safe harbor for new tokens.
Ah, yes. Fenwick laid this out. That sounds like it could be a big deal for startups.
It really could. The idea is if a project intends for its blockchain to become mature within 4 years and they don't raise like a crazy amount of money right away, the draft says $150 million in a year,
Okay.
then they could get a temporary break from full SEC registration.
But they still have to disclose things, right? It's not a free pass.
Oh, absolutely not. During that safe harbor, they'd need to file an offering statement, financials, info about the team, the tech, the distribution plan, the roadmap to maturity.
And keep updating it.
Yeah, semi-annual and current reports. So it's less intense than full securities registration, but still aims for transparency.
And this mature blockchain system concept, that's the trigger for switching oversight, kind of.
Pretty much. Luxology and Fenwick describe the criteria. Basically, it needs to be truly decentralized, not controlled by one group. Value comes from its code. It's open source, governed by rules, not people.
So really decentralized. And the SEC would certify this.
That's the proposal, yeah. The SEC oversees the certification. Once it's certified as mature, then the regulation shifts more towards secondary market stuff, with both the SEC and CFTC involved, but the CFTC taking the lead on the digital commodity exchanges, brokers, etc.
And the CFTC would have rules for those exchanges, listing standards, customer protection.
Yeah, Fenwick mentions things like listing requirements and, crucially, segregation of customer assets, making sure exchanges keep customer money separate from their own.
That seems pretty important after FTX.
Definitely.
And the draft bill has other bits too, right? Like updating record-keeping rules for blockchains.
Mm-hmm. Modernizing that.
And defining things like airdrops and staking rewards and user distributions, they call them, and maybe exempting them.
Yeah, exempting them from certain securities rules, potentially,
Right.
and some specific exemptions for DeFi activities, too, again, as long as the anti-fraud rules still apply.
Gotcha. And Luxology mentioned tougher disclosures for the developers themselves.
Right. So overall, it's an attempt to create rules that actually fit how these things work, addressing some of the gray areas.
Okay, a lot going on in Congress. Now, let's shift gears a bit to the Trump administration's impact. Money Laundering Watch has covered this. There seems to be a signal towards maybe easing up.
Yeah, that's the sense, a potential shift in tone and maybe enforcement priorities.
What could that mean long term? More innovation maybe, but what about, consumer protection?
Well, the big thing was that executive order back in January 2025. The stated goal was regulatory clarity and certainty.
And they set up that interagency working group.
Right, the working group on digital asset markets, led by their sort of crypto and AI czar, and they set some pretty aggressive timelines.
Like 30 days to identify rules, 60 days for recommendations on changing or ditching them, 180 days for a full report.
Yeah, very ambitious. Whether they meet them is another question, but it signals intent.
And it's not just the working group. The SEC itself formed its own crypto task force, right? Here by Hester Pierce now.
That's significant, too. Pierce has, historically been critical of the SEC's regulation by enforcement approach.
So the focus of her task force might be different.
It seems that way. Money Laundering Watch highlighted her statement about focusing on clear guidelines, paths to registration, sensible disclosures, looking at everything from security status, custody staking, ETPs, even a cross-border sandbox.
A more proactive, maybe less purely enforcement-driven approach.
Potentially, yeah. More about building the framework.
And we've seen some actual changes already, haven't we? According to Money Laundering Watch.
We have. The SEC ending investigations into OpenSea, Robinhood, dismissing the charges against Coinbase.
And saying meme coins generally aren't securities, that's quite a shift.
It is, both in words and actions.
There's always a but.
Right. Money Laundering Watch is careful to point out this doesn't mean enforcement is dead. Look at the OKX guilty plea operating an unlicensed money transmitter.
Ah, so anti-money laundering, AML, is still very much a focus.
Absolutely. That seems consistent. And another point they raise is interesting. Even if federal agencies pull back a bit, we might just see more private lawsuits popping up.
So the enforcement landscape might change shape, but not disappear entirely. Less federal focus maybe, but still AML and private cases.
That seems like a plausible scenario, yeah.
Okay, one last piece here. DeFi Planet reported on the possibility of the SEC and CFTC actually collaborating more.
Yeah, potentially reestablishing that joint advisory committee they used to have.
The CFTC SEC Advisory Committee on Emerging Regulatory Issues sounds useful.
It was set up after the 2008 crisis, aimed at better coordination, spotting risks early. It's been dormant for over 10 years, though.
But now there's talk of bringing it back. DeFi Planet mentions CFTC Acting Chair Pham supports it.
Yeah, her support suggests there's a desire, at least from the CFTC side, for a more joined-up approach.
Which kind of makes sense, given everything we've discussed. The complexity, the overlaps.
Exactly, and DeFi Planet connects it to the bigger picture, keeping the U.S. competitive globally. Other countries are moving forward with their own crypto rules.
Right, so if the U.S. wants to stay a leader in this space, getting that regulatory clarity, maybe through better agency cooperation, is pretty crucial.
It seems essential, fostering innovation while still having sensible guardrails.
Okay, so wrapping this all up.
Yeah.
It's clear things are really in flux with U.S. digital asset regulation.
Definitely dynamic.
We've got this ongoing tension, this shifting balance between the SEC and the CFTC. We've got significant efforts in Congress trying to build a real framework like that big market structure bill. And then we have the new administration potentially changing the enforcement vibe, alongside the possibility of maybe, just maybe, more collaboration between the regulators.
Yeah, lots of moving parts. The future shape of crypto regulation here is still very much being decided. It's not set in stone at all.
Which leads us to a final thought for you, listening in.
Considering all these changes, the agency roles, the laws being proposed, the administration's stance, what do you see as the biggest hurdle or maybe the biggest opportunity for crypto and digital assets in the next few years?
Yeah, and what kind of regulatory balance do you think would actually work best? How do you encourage that innovation we talked about, but also make sure consumers are properly protected?
It's something worth mulling over, definitely, as the story continues to unfold.